Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Rabbi Adam Kligfeld's weekly Rashi study class.
So Boker Tov, everybody. Nice to see you all. Boker Tov. Happy Cheshvan. Hope it's not at all bitter. Hope you all know that that's a midrash and not pshat, that Mar Cheshvan, which, the rabbis love to play the word games. A lot of people read it as bitter Cheshvan, bitter because it has no holidays. It's so obvious that that's not the case, particularly because back when the Hebrew calendar was beginning to be created, there were many months that had no holidays. We're used to, holidays every month, but, Shvat didn't have any holidays either back then in the biblical era, and neither did Kislev or Tevet for that matter. And I don't know why I'm telling you this, but it's Cheshvan. So most people believe that the origin of Mar Cheshvan is Akkadian. Warach Shaman, Warach Yareach, month, Shaman Shmona, eighth month. If you start with Nisan as the first month, then Cheshvan is the 8th month, and a metathesis happened, and a mem turned to a vav, and a vav turned to a mem. So Yarach became Marach, and Shaman became Waman. So Mar Cheshwaman, Mar Cheshvan. That's probably how it happened, but the midrash is still a good one. But even so, I hope there's nothing bitter about your Cheshvanim so far. Okay, we are away from the troughs, and I need to get to the right page. I'm so distracted by trying to get Facebook to work that I got to the wrong page. Okay, so we're on page Kaf of the 8th Torah Chaim pagination. We finished verse 17, right? We finished the work on Vayir Garshum, right? I know we discussed the grammar of that sentence, who is doing the sending away, who is being sent away, and we looked at the one word Rashi, who weighs in and says, who's sending the way? The local shepherds are sending away. Whom are being sent away? The Bnot of Yitro. Why they're being sent away? Mipnei hanidui, because they had been put in some kind of a religious cherem because their father had the audacity of questioning idolatry. And I think that's where we are, which means that we should
Yud Tet.
What's that?
Yud Tet.
Yud Tet, right. Because we read verse Yud Chet and there was no Rashi on it. So let's read verse Yud Chet one more time to get going, and then we'll move into the slower reading. Verse Yud Chet, which we read, was Vatavona el Ru'el Abihen. They came to Ru'el, their father. We asked the question, why is he not called Yitro here? And we discussed how that's like an anachronistic question because we don't even yet know his name is Yitro. So it's not why is his name Yitro here. It's why is his name Yitro later if the first time we're introduced to him is Ru'el? Vayomer, and he said, Madua, why? Miharten, did you hurry? Bo, in your coming, Hayom. Why did you come home early today? And we talked about how that could be read as suggesting that they are often harassed at the well. Okay. And now we're on verse 19. Everyone agree as to where we are? Okay, Barry, do you want to read verse 19? Boker Tov, Andrew. Nice to see you. Nice to see all of you, but Andrew just arrived onto my screen, so I'm saying hello to him.
Toma'arna ish mitzri hishilanu miyad haraim v'gam dalo lanu v'yesh et hatzon.
Okay, let's see what you can do in a translation there, Barry.
So they answered their father Ruel.
Yeah, that's right. About Tomona, they said, they feminine plural said, correct?
Yeah, to Ruel, their father. I'm in the wrong line. I skipped. They said an Egyptian saved us from the hands of the shepherds, and this is the drewing drawing.
Good. He verily drew.
For us, and the sheep that watered the sheep.
Very good. Okay. So I'll point out a few things in the verse, and then I'll ask for your questions. So first of all, once again, we have dalo, dala, which seems to be a transitive verb that would beg the thing being drawn, right? We discussed that when the first time we had the verb, but it's left here without a direct object. He drew for us. He drew what for us? Obviously, it's water, but there's something kind of missing there. Once again, we have haroim, the shepherds, being written lashon chaser without the vav, allowing for some interesting midrashim. One of you, at least last week, discussed how maybe this is haraim, right? The evil ones, because it reads as haraim. But we also could read as hareim, which means our dear friends. It's a reish ayin is a great root, meaning lots of different things. The kind of the question I'll put out there for you to ask, you can ask questions on the questions, is why do we think, or how do we think that Benot Ruel know that he's an Ish Mitzri? And isn't it interesting that the first time he shows up in the place where he's going to attach his burgeoning monotheism to Yitro's burgeoning monotheism, he's initially identified as an Egyptian, right? What's going on with their recognizing that, and what's going on with us as the reader, one level up? Why are we being told that they recognize him as an Ish Mitzri? So that's kind of starting the conversation, and now I throw it out to you. Questions on the verse, Norm, and then Tova.
Not a question, but why they think he's Egyptian is probably he has clothes that seem Egyptian or are from Egypt. He may have an Egyptian, he may speak
accent.
He may speak Egyptian or merely have an Egyptian accent, which they likely would recognize, even if he speaks some Midian or whatever other Semitic language they speak. And he, they weren't silent with him. He may have explained that he's from Egypt.
Good. So you're right. There are plenty of ways to answer the question. How does he know he's an Egyptian? His speech, his clothing, they spoke to him. So then you can go to the question up. Why is it significant for the Torah to tell us that they recognize him as an Egyptian? Why is his Egyptianness being inserted into this verse?
I think it's
critical to the scene.
I think it's important that they told their father that. Because who else would have stepped in for them? It certainly wasn't going to be one of the shepherds from the local community. Yeah. It would have to be some kind of an outsider who decided to change the normal course and step in for them. And so they're telling him who it was. It wasn't somebody from Aram. It was somebody from the other direction, from Egypt.
Great. Thanks, Norm. And Rachel. Tova.
The thing that really struck me about this was, again, Ish Mitzri, but more because the last time those two words were used was Moses killing an Ish Mitzri.
Right.
And I think it just seems clear, because there's so many other ways that this could have been written, for them to echo that term again. It really seems like that's being called attention to. And that with him killing it, we have killing an Ish Mitzri, we have a sense of him perceiving a difference, creating an otherness, that he is identifying with the people of Israel against the assault of another. And now he's being identified with that. And it's sort of challenging creating otherness in people. So that's like, I'm thinking a lot about that. But I agree with Norm on some of the things that must have tipped them off that this was an Egyptian man. But it also delves into the nature of his own identity.
I think you're onto something very rich there, Tova, and I think that it's just a short phrase, Ish Mitzri, just two simple Hebrew words, but I think the proximity of the last Ish Mitzri, the rabbis would say Ze Omer Darsheni. This is saying drash me, right?
Exactly, because Ish, a man, saved us. It could, but yeah.
And the kind of the pinging back and forth between is he the person recognizing he's an Israelite who's beating the Ish Mitzri, or is he an Ish Mitzri, or does he not know? And are you even permitted to? Are you able to define who you are, or are you defined by how others see you? And if they see him as an Ish Mitzri, and the complex nature of his about to be going up against the very people who raised him, right?
Yeah.
your comment brings something to mind. I mentioned in one of my highlighted sermons, I think, that I've been listening to Malcolm Gladwell's podcast recently, and the one I happened to listen to yesterday, a powerful and painful podcast on tokenism using Sammy Davis Jr. as an example. And a little piece of history that I did not know of, because it happened, basically before I was born, and it never appeared on in my history lessons before. And some of you who are a little bit older might remember this moment. It was called the Hug Heard Round the World, where he hugged Richard Nixon from behind at a rally, and kind of an awkward hug. But then he was even more awkward that Sammy Davis Jr. was kind of pilloried by particularly his black peers, for embracing someone that they understood to be, representing American whiteness in a very, very, in the 70s version of the way, as opposed to the current version of the way. And the episode is about how hard Sammy Davis Jr. worked in his voice, in whom he performed to be not a black man performing for whites, but really in the club, right, in the Rat Pack. And he was really the first black entertainer who could get 50,000 white people into an auditorium and perform for them. And at the end of his career, he is the object of the Dean Martin roast. Some of you have seen versions of that. It used to be a common thing, I think, on NBC. Comedy Central now does versions of the roast. In fact, if you want to see something like disgusting but prescient, this is a parentheses and a parentheses. Look up Comedy Central roast of Donald Trump from about 6 or 7 years ago, or 8 or 9 years ago. And it's pretty crazy to imagine that happening to the person who's going to be the president of the United States. But what Gladwell points out is that after spending 60 years in the business, not quite unblacking himself, but trying to be able to just be with entertainers an entertainer, not to be a black entertainer, the entirety of the roast is what we would consider to be a disgusting array of racist and racial humor, right? Like, you couldn't get away with one of those jokes now, and for good reason, right? But even if you could get away with those jokes then, the fact that he was reduced at the very end of his career, all you are to us is a black man dancing, right? So now insert that into Moshe and Ish Mitzri, right? So Moshe is about to become the most powerful, most prominent non-Mitzri that the Torah raises up. And yet his first time leaving Mitzrayim, he's identified as an Ish Mitzri. So there's a lot in what you said in terms of his identity. Okay, thank you for allowing me to go on that riff. I got Larry, Diane, Marshall, and then Barry.
I'm glad you went on that riff. It was very interesting. I'm glad you have discovered Malcolm Gladwell. He's a great iconoclast, and everyone should listen to his podcast. He gets you to look at something you're sure you know in a different way. I'm actually, one other comment about that. I listened to the podcast on watching the dog, and I have spatial association. So I know exactly where I was when I heard that part of that podcast that you just described, when it talked about at the end of the podcast. I don't know why that is, but it happens. In any case, I want to talk about something else here, but also in the Torah in general, and it relates to this week's Parsha and the Tower of Babel and language. We read all these stories about movement and people coming to different places. Abraham moving from Ur Kasdim to Canaan, and Joseph being thrown in the well and then being taken to Egypt, and Eliezer going back to the homeland to get a wife, and now here. And we just don't even think about the language. What language are they speaking? And how do they understand these people? Since there are so many different languages, which we know not only from the story of the Torah, but we know in real life. In Africa, for example, the density of languages is very, very high. And you go very short distances and you get tribes speaking very different languages and almost incomprehensible. So how do they trade? How do they move? So at least I know in Africa and in parts of Asia, there are these super languages that are almost like what we would call pidgin. They're simplified versions of languages, taking bits and pieces from languages in other places. In West Africa, there are 3 of them that are spoken over the span of West Africa. So I rather imagine that when Moses was in Midian, he was neither speaking Egyptian Mitzri, nor was he speaking whatever the Midian language was. There was probably some sort of, I don't know what the technical term is, but there's a technical term of these super languages that have a very limited vocabulary. And so you can't talk philosophy very well, but you certainly can negotiate or invite someone to dinner or chase someone from a well. And I haven't gone back to look at all the different places, but as far as I can tell, no commentators ever asked the question, how did he speak that language? Not of him, not of Joseph, not of Abraham, but I'm asking, how did they communicate? And how did that affect their interactions?
Yeah. I mean, a great set of reflections and questions. By the way, I've been reading Gladwell for years, and for a while, Noah and I were enjoying his podcast when we were in England for a few months. We would take the different things. We were enjoying his podcast then. I forgot about them, and I've just come back into them, and they're wonderful. I feel incredibly enriched after hearing each one. Your question is particularly interesting because the Torah, as you reference, goes to pains to let us know that the initial notion of a single language got broken into to many, many pieces in the dispersal after the Tower of Babel. So if the Torah goes so far to let us know that no one post-Babel understands each other, how are we supposed to understand how people are understanding each other? And the question about why that's not, I'm sure there is some comment on that, but it's not like a running conversation that the Mefarshim are having with us. In case you're wondering how Joseph's brothers communicated with the Ishmaelim, it's just not there. So I don't know nearly enough about ancient linguistics to know if these simplified pidgin languages existed. But I think the Tova may. But the idea of thinking about that is interesting, and it does make me wish that Ludwig Zamenhof had been more successful than he was in proliferating Esperanto, because it would be nice to have like a simple language overarching the entire globe. Right, Diane?
Yeah. So I just want to say this story is particularly sparse. When you think about the story of Jacob at the well and all that, the story is much richer, and how he goes back to the house. The story is much richer in detail. And this one, as it progresses, it's got a lot of empty spaces. So going back to the question about Moshe, you have to wonder what he saw as his identity at this point. Did he identify himself as an Ish Mitzri? Or how did he introduce himself? Yes.
Let me put Tova into the slot now, because I think she has a specific answer to that comment, and then we'll go back to Marshall and Barry, which was the previous order.
I don't know if it's significant, but there were, as was true in Europe with French, and there were diplomatic languages, and at that time, Akkadian was the common diplomatic language of the Middle East and Egypt. And the stelae that were found in Tel Amarna, which was under Akhenaten, they were written in Akkadian. And that was correspondence between the court and the Hittites, Middle East. They were all written in Akkadian. So at least a level of society had a common language that was more than just a Creole. It was a fully developed language. But the other thing I wanted to say is, in a way contrary to Babel, we are very monolinguistic in our own thinking, but I remember there's a wonderful episode in the documentary that was based on Guns, Germs, and Steel, on Jared Diamond's book about the development of civilizations, where he's talking to a classroom of like 8-year-old African children. And he asked them, how many of you speak 4 languages, and about a quarter of the kids raise their hand.
Wow.
How many of you speak 3? Another quarter. And when he got down, there was none of them that only spoke 1 language. And he said, what would you think if I told you that where I came from, most people only speak 1 language? And the entire class broke into hysterical laughter. When groups lived in proximity to one another and spoke languages that were different but had some similarity, it was really common for people to speak multiple languages fairly adeptly. So
I find that to be an unfortunate aspect of quote, American exceptionalism.
Yeah.
One of the things that we're most exceptional at is being terrible at other people's languages. Part of that has to do with the fact that we intuit the fact that, English, we can get by in at least pidgin English in most places in the world. Some of you know Michael Stoyer is a member of the synagogue. He grew up in Amsterdam, and he speaks 7 languages. He just speaks. He didn't study them for years at university. He speaks German, he speaks French, he speaks English, he speaks Dutch, he speaks Hebrew, he can get by in Yiddish, right? And so Europeans and even South Americans are much better at that than us, and that's unfortunate.
Well, we could add to that, it's not just us, it's also the British. We asked that once when we were there, and they said, yeah, they're also abysmal at other second languages. Same reliance.
One of my cousins whom I've spoken about at times from the Bima, he was my grandmother's first cousin, and he was kind of the Zionist patriarch of the family, who grew up in Poland as very close friends with Menachem Begin. They fled to Palestine together. He also was, first of all, he was an autodidact, and he was a polymath, and he was brilliant. But he also spoke in innumerable number of languages. I wanted to ask him about it. He says, once you've gotten the first 7 down, the 8th is easy.
No, it's true.
Because you trained your brain in that way. Okay, long wait. Marshall and then Barry. Marshall, we don't hear you yet. Let me unmute you or ask you to unmute. Okay.
If we go back to verse 17, we see Vayavo haroim vayigarshum, and the shepherds came and they chased them away, referring to the daughters. Vayakol Moshe vayoshi'an, and Moses rose up and saved them. Here referring to the daughters in the third person feminine. Vayashket sonam, could have been sonan also, and he caused to water their flock. And yet if we come now to our verse, sort of interesting, Vatomarna ish mitzri hitzilanu. So this Egyptian man saved us from the hand of the Roim, and then Begam Dalo Dala Lanu, and he also, I guess, drew the water up for us, and then Vayash et Hatzon, and then he caused to water the flock. So I'm just focusing. Why didn't they not say Vayash et Tsonanu or something like that?
So in their own reference of it, there's a reference to us in parts of the sentence, but not referencing the tzon. It was their tzon in the previous verse, but now it's just the flock. Interesting. Yeah. Good question. Barry?
Okay. So to get back to the storyline, all the discussion we were having on language is very interesting, but I think the playwright here is staging this very plainly for us that this is not a Hebrew. He's been introduced in this new environment, not as a Hebrew.
Right. And therefore?
And the story continues on that basis, and identity comes later.
Got it. Good. Okay. Rashi is quiet on this verse. We have had a lot to say. Rashi is quiet in this verse. 2 verses in a row that Rashi is quiet. Any other questions you want to raise up on this verse and or answer some of the questions that haven't already raised? Joel?
I just wanted to know if you could go over Chizkuni, because he talks about this, but I don't understand what he's saying.
Let's take a look.
And I'm surprised that Larry didn't bring this up.
No, but Chizkuni doesn't comment on this verse. Does he say something about it in a previous verse?
In Sepharia he does. He says, Alinyan, no, wait a second. Mishma shelo gila lahem eretz moladato velo zachal likaber ba'artzo. he says he doesn't reveal to them his place of birth, and therefore he doesn't, have the he's not qualified to be buried there.
This is Chizkuni on that verse?
Yeah.
There's in my book, Chizkuni
it's in brackets. I don't know what that means. It's in brackets in Sepharia, which might mean it doesn't appear in all versions.
Right. It might be that it's like maybe attributed to Chizkuni. Usually our volume would have included that. It maybe said, Leta b'tfush rishon, not in the first printing, but I don't see those words at all. But I'll still try to make sense of it. Say it one more time.
Mishma, mem shin, mem ayin.
Mashma. So what this means is,
shelo gila lahem eretz moladato.
He didn't.
V'lo zacha likaber be'artzo.
The what?
V'lo zacha likaber be'artzo. So he didn't. He wasn't qualified to be buried in the land, in his land.
Without looking more closely at it, I'm not sure. Yes, zacha does mean merit here. I'm not sure what the reference is. I don't know. Sorry. Okay. Any other comments or questions on this verse before we go forward? Sue?
On what Joel just said, that he didn't reveal to them where his birth origin is, because he wouldn't merit being buried in the land. He may be worried about where he has now fled, and he may be worried about the future. If he tells anybody where he's from, that they don't know where they're going to put him. I mean, it might be a concern about what his future is about.
I'm looking at it right now on Safari, see if I can make one more attempt at understanding it. I'm not sure. I mean, I understand the words. I'm not sure what it's adding to the conversation, and it kind of makes sense that it might be in brackets, that it may not have been actually written or contributed by Chizkuni. Okay, we'll have to leave it as a puzzle. Okay, so then let's go on to the next verse. Barry, you're still up because you haven't hit a Rashi yet, so you get to do one more verse. You got to unmute, Barry. We don't hear you yet.
Sounded pretty good to me. Okay. Vayomer el benotav. Lama azaftem et aish kirecha lo yochal lachem.
Okay.
So he said to his daughters, why you're here? Why the man? I'll make it up. You left the man.
Good. That's not making it up. Exactly right. Yeah.
And call him that he can eat bread.
Great. Right. The one word I want to slow down on is ve'ayo. Ve'ayo is ayeh, which means where, declined in the male third person singular. Where is he? You may know this word from ayeka. What God says to Adam after the sin is, where are you? Ayeka. So where are you? Ayo, where is he? So in biblical Hebrew, Aleph Yud or Aleph Yud Hey was where. Okay. So he says to his daughters, after they tell him the story that we just read, the Ayo, then where is he? Right? Lama ze azavten ta'ish. I'll introduce a question, although I'm really interested in your questions. What's the Zed doing here, right? Lama azavten et ta'ish would have been fine. Why did you leave or abandon the man? What's the Zed doing there? Okay. And then kir enlo, go call him, v'yochal lachem, and he will eat bread. He will dine with us. Lech lachem as opposed to lechem for the same reason hamotzi lechem in haaretz, that it's a segolate noun in a pausal part of the verse. Okay, that's what the words mean. Questions? Leonard, Rebecca, then Day and Larry.
Hi, I actually had a couple comments on the last verse. Is it too late for that? Or?
Oh, I don't know, Leonard. We're so past verse 19. Yes, absolutely. Go ahead.
Okay, so somebody named Ha'amak Davar.
That's the Netziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who was the Rosh Yeshiva in Volozhin in the late 19th century.
Okay, so he says that they, the girls recognize Moses as an Egyptian because of his clothing and his language. But then he adds to that from here we learn, or that the rabbis teach us, that all of Israel did not change their clothes or their language in Egypt. I don't know how you get one from another, but it sounds like the Israelites in Egypt kept their language and kept their clothing, but Moses, since he grew up in the palace, didn't have either of those. So that's comment number one.
Meaning, then, I think what he's saying is the way that they identified him as an Egyptian and not as an Israelite is that had he really been an Israelite who grew up with the Israelites, he would have still spoken whatever language we imagine the Israelites spoke then and dressed like them. That he was, this connect maybe to Tova's comment about who is he really? He appears as an Egyptian, even though he's about to be the savior of the Israelites from the Egyptians.
Yeah, I think that's right. And then the other thing is that the father or the grandfather says to the girls, "Hey, you guys are home early today." And Ramban has a very long comment on this, but the very last phrase of that very long comment says that this is because the shepherds would chase them away every day when they came to the to the well and filled it with water. So this was an everyday occurrence. So it was quite noticeable when they showed up that they were early, because that's something that never happens.
Right. We kind of made a glancing reference to this last week. What was novel was not that they were harassed. What was novel is that the harassment ended, right? Which makes Moshe's presence as a savior type even more like present in the verse. Good. Larry Dayan.
So I'm going to answer your question. But first I want to comment on sort of a meta question, which is when I was young and learned in school, public school, to write, I remember many of my teachers telling us to remove all of the ands from all of our sentences. And clearly the vav is not always and, maybe it's even not very often and, but I'm struck with the vayomer, v'ayo, and v'yochal. And I think that they all have meaning besides and. So your question about the zeh is because I don't think this is Yitro. I think that it's Yitro's father. I think it's the grandfather. The grandfather to me is kind of like my grandmother. So what he is saying to his daughters is, so where is he? What is this? You left that man? Call him and let him come and eat. Because this is what a Jewish grandmother or grandfather do, even though they're not Jewish, is they say, we want to feed him. So I think that the Hebrew actually has this sense of this sort of admonition and astonishment. Why wouldn't you invite him into our house? Why did you just leave him there? But then I want to ask you more seriously about the vavs and whether the vav on ayo actually should be interpreted to mean so where is he, or what the heck is going on, or something like that. And then also the vav at the very end, v'yochal lechem, which is a strange way of saying, let him eat, or let's feed him. In fact, it isn't, if I understand correctly, and let's feed him, it's let him eat. I don't know if that makes a difference in the way in which you put it. Okay,
so I like your, I'll call it a cute reading of lamazeh as its own phrase, right? That it's not lamazeh as of 10, but lamazeh, why is this happening, right? Almost like a little burst of conversation. So let's hold that as a sweet reading. It's interesting that you point out the vavs, because each of the three vavs that you mention in the verse are totally different from one another grammatically. The vav of vayomer is clearly a vav hayipuch. It's a verb that looks like a future tense verb, but it's understood as a past tense, and it's the Torah's natural way of continuing from the previous thought, right? So it switches over the form. We've discussed this many times, mostly just to like tie together the previous verse to this one. The vav an vayocha lachem is not a vav hayipuch because it's a future verb and it's supposed to be read future. It's not saying and he ate with them. It's let him eat, literally, and he may eat with us. So that's just a vav, right? That one is just an and, right? Call him, and what'll happen next? And he'll eat with us, perhaps. The vav on v'ayo is neither and is the most extraneous, because with vayomer el benotav, he said to his daughters, ayo, where is he? The vav on vavayo is not a vav hayipuch. It's not switching around the form, and it's not it's not telling us what happened next or what could happen next. It's almost as if you want to put a Jewish voice into Ruel's head. He said to them, "And where is he?" Right, like intentionally beginning the sentence with an unneeded "and." Right. To emphasize kind of a tone of voice. So there's three very different vavs, interestingly, and I appreciate that you picked up on them. Let's go Renee and then Tova.
So it's interesting that in Everett Fox, that when he says that he can eat bread, that he puts the "with us" in parentheses and an exclamation point.
I'm looking at it.
They have to clarify it, and it's not just a given that he's said that they should have invited him to have bread with them.
Yeah.
I mean, who else is he going to have bread with?
And I got to tell you, looking at Everett Fox, he partially agrees with Larry's read, how he punctuates it.
Yeah.
He said to his daughters, so where is he, ? All hyphenated. V'ayo. So where is he? It's exactly how I was reading it. V'ayo. Yeah, no, where is he? Right? Right. And now, for what reason, hyphenated as a word, which I have him as translating lama zeh. What is this? For what reason? For what reason is the lama? He turns the zeh into a then. For what reason then? Lama zeh. For what reason then? Have you left the man behind? Call him, that he may eat bread, parentheses, with us, end parentheses, exclamation point. So he's doing something in that verse. It's not 100% clear, but he's on your wavelength a little bit, Larry. Good. Tova and then Sue? Or Sue, is that specifically related to what I just said? Okay, Tova.
Okay. To the thing that caught my attention in this, to take it back to the verse we were talking about, is the use of ish, which of course is common enough to be used, but in the context of what's just come before, we talked about how Ish Mitzri reflects or might reflect on the character of Moshe, but thinking of it from the perspective of how the daughters saw him, they saw him as an Egyptian man.
Yeah.
And I almost get the sense that they have come back, not because he scared them, but he was different, he was exotic, and that's what's on their mind. And in the voice of Ra'u Yitro, grandfather, father, whatever, is this grounding of where is the man? Not Mitzri, not this, but a man, a human being who did you a service. Where is the man? And I think the balance between the two phrases is nice.
Great. Thank you for that. Sue, and then I see Barry's hand, and then I see Norm's hand.
Okay.
Oh, there you go.
This kind of tags on to what Tova just said kind of nicely. We don't always have such a perfect adherence to right pronoun in a sentence. Like this is, it's so heavy, my daughters, and every verb, the conjugation of the verb is perfect to the daughters and doesn't ever waver. I mean, that's kind of, I know it's stating the obvious. To what Tova just said, it just seems to me that now we're talking about my daughters. Where's the guy? You found a guy? Where's the guy? I got all these daughters. Bring me the guy. And so all of a sudden it popped up for me as in contrast to the daughters, you know. So, and in fact, that's where it kind of goes. So like there was a guy, he fed the little flock. Where is he? Bread.
As a mother who married off one of her daughters the same. Right. But let's wait. Then and now, once your kids are potty trained and can tie their own shoes, it's the primary thing you're trying to figure out for them, right? Or waiting for it to happen, right? So we have an indication, and Rashi's going to play with that a little bit on the word lechem, if we get that far, that already there's a scene here, and what's already brewing is a shidduch, right? And the Torah makes Reuel, father or grandfather, very early on interested in where is the guy, who is the guy. So Rashi will slow us down a little bit, but I think that innuendo, which is going to be resolved very quickly, is hovering already. Barry, then Norm, and Rachel?
That was the direction I was going to go. We to invited him to eat the bread. It's not come let him have lunch. It's just more than that.
Right.
It's come and bring him into this household.
Right. Good. Norm, Rachel?
I think I know why they did not invite him back. They perceived him as an Egyptian. Everybody knows the Egyptians are polytheists. They're afraid that if they invite him home, he's going to find out that they are monotheists, and he's going to turn on them, and he won't be helpful the next day. Instead, he'll be a hindrance the next day when they come to water their flocks. And so they do not on their own invite him in, because we know he's a monotheist, but they don't know this. And that's why it says that he was an Egyptian man. They're warning their father or grandfather, as the case may be, this guy may not be so great.
Yeah. What you're doing here is interesting. I want to point it out, but it's interesting. You're now reading the Pshat of Ish Mitzri, which Rashi doesn't comment on, through Rashi's midrashic reading of the Nidui, right? So the Pshat of Ish Mitzri doesn't have to respond to Rashi's ex post facto drash on it, and it's saying that Rashi doesn't comment on it. But yes, once Rashi lays a prism for us, it's hard to escape it, which is why you see, as we discussed, certain translations, particularly in Art Scroll, read Pshat based on how Rashi has translated, right? So yes, it adds a layer to it, but it's a reminder that we don't know from the verse that Reuel has left polytheism, just that Rashi, through the Midrash, wants us to read it that way. But still, good stuff. Rebecca Leonard.
So I'm remembering back to where Joseph is there with his brothers, and they're eating, and he's eating in a separate room because the Egyptians don't eat with the common folk.
Correct.
I'm wondering if that's what's happening over here, that this is a well-known custom, so they didn't invite him home because they know that the Egyptian wouldn't eat with them.
And that may be another reason why the verse emphasizes that they think, or they're seeing him as an Ish Mitzri. Yeah. What we're going to see in a second with the Torah's silence is that the daughters don't answer him. The daughters don't explain. He asks a why question, and the Torah doesn't resolve with their answer. The Torah just resolves with Moshe, and then eventually eats with them, right? Okay, so I think that is the end of the questions that I see on the verse. Let's look at how Rashi handles some of this. Barry, if you're up for it, you're still on. You own this verse.
Let me get where it was here. So am I starting with Lama Zan Azavtan?
Correct.
Why did you ban? So Hikirbo Shehu Mazaro Shel Yaakov. I'm just reading my translation here. He realized that he was a descendant of Yaakov.
Keep reading.
Shechamayim olim likrato, for whom the waters of the Nile rose.
Okay. Now, in those 8 or 9 Hebrew words, there is a lot going on, and there's a lot of inside baseball that you need to have know/remember from Rashi's before to make sense of what he's saying. Let me I'm trying to think of the order in which I want to tease this out. So the way Barry read and translated is exactly right? That he kir bo, so the he here is Ru'el. Bo, it refers to Moshe. So Ru'el recognized in him Moshe that he is a descendant of Jacob. For the mayim, the water, olim, it's interesting, it's present tense. The water is rising, likrato, to meet him. Let's go this direction. What's the reference to Yaakov? Does anyone remember anything midrashically that we've discussed that connects Yaakov, Jacob, to water coming to meet him? Sue?
The wells, his father's wells. Didn't he find all of the? Didn't he find the wells?
Finds the wells that Abraham had dug. So that's one generation.
That's what I was thinking about it.
But I would say within the last, I don't know, I've lost track of time, year, this class has paid at least 7 minutes of attention. How come we don't all remember this? To something Rashi says about the Yaakov's relationship with the water, with the Nile. When Yaakov comes to Egypt, there's an interaction between Yaakov and Pharaoh. Pharaoh, who
Yaakov? Yosef or Yaakov?
Yaakov. That somehow when Yaakov arrives in the land of Egypt, this magical power he brought with him, the famine ended, right? Rashi had to do this math about how long the famine lasted. It actually had stopped when Yaakov got there, and that the waters of the Nile, which had been depleted through the famine and the drought, literally come up to kiss Yaakov's feet. They greet Yaakov's feet at the edge. And Pharaoh is so taken by this holy man who has power over the very things that Pharaoh thinks that he and his gods have power over. So Yaakov midrashically is understood. And listen, there are a lot of our ancestors are associated with water. Miriam, and yes, Yitzchak and the wells of Abraham. But Yaakov is understood midrashically as having had the power to draw up the water that had been low in the Nile up to where his feet were. Okay, so that's what the phrase is, Shehamayim olim likrato, that for whom the water had risen up to his feet. Now my second question is, so in what way then, let's assume Yitro knows that midrash, right? And Yitro knows that that's a Yacovian thing, a Jacobian thing. What does this comment suggest that Yitro / Ruel is picking up on in Moshe, such that he thinks he has that genetic trait? How is that a resolution of this verse? Barry?
I'm not sure if I have a resolution, but apparently Ruel has prophetic capabilities. He's just not the father of these daughters, and not just a deposed priest because he's monotheist, but he has prophetic capabilities, and he's aware of the unfolding story.
Right. So that's how, inside Rashi's comment, we can imagine Yitro knowing things not other people would know. I want to know, let's say we grant that he knows that. How is that connected to Moshe in this scene? And by the way, Norm, that's interesting. If you can pull up the Geshem prayer online to remind us of the exact line that is associated with Yaakov, because what Norm was referring to is that in the Geshem prayer, which we just said, there are 6 stanzas referring to 5 of our ancestors and then all of the people of Israel, and poetically attaching each of them to water stuff. So remind us of, if you can find it, of the exact line with Yaakov. But anyone else want to try to answer that question? Otherwise, I can give you my thought to answer my own question. Barbara? Oh, I unmuted you, and then you thought to unmute you, and I unmuted yourself.
Okay, I think he's connecting Moshe to Jacob, to Yaakov, and saying this must be a monotheist, an Israelite, not an Egyptian. I think he's thinking the daughters are wrong. Moshe must be an Israelite.
Why? Why does Ruel pick up on that?
Because of the water, he's figuring that the water had risen for both of these two people. There must be something within the Israelites that gets the water to rise up when they come to the wells.
Good. I think you're right there. And Rashi doesn't make it explicit. I think Rashi wants us to make the jump that since this guy was dalo dalalanu, he not only did he send away the other shepherds, but he so, easily just drew water for us. He must be like those Israelites who have magic with water. In fact, in one of the super commentaries on Rashi,
I think he's saying he must be one of those Israelites, not just like them.
Right. So in the one of the midrashim from which Rashi draws this, no pun intended, which is Shemot Rabbah, we have the following: Lefi she'amrulo, because they, the daughters, said to him, their father, V'gam dalo dala lanu, for verily he has drawn for us. This is a very forced read, but this is, I think, what's pushing this. B'dilia achat. It seems that he drew once. Dalo dala, he drew in one moment. Lanu, and somehow it was sufficient for all of us. Dala et hakol b'dilia achat. Since he was able to draw once and water us and our flock, that suggests he's miraculous at bringing the water to him. That makes him Jacobian. Okay, now we've resolved 2 or 3 of the problems in the verse. Here's the key question I want to ask: What question in the verse does this comment answer? Now we understand the answer, but what's the problem in the verse such that this is the answer to it? And in particular, although we know that Rashi himself didn't choose these diburei hamatchil, the words on which the comment is based, they are ex post facto attempts to figure out which word he's commenting on. But it's a pretty established ex post facto that the words he is commenting on are lama ze azavten. Why did you leave? Why did you leave this guy? Why is the answer we've now figured out? Yaakov, Ruel realized that he was a descendant, or he was connected to Yaakov who had water power magic. How is that an explanation of the words, why did you leave him? Anyone? I'll tell you what I think, but I don't know, because this is some of the puzzle of Rashi. Rashi doesn't explain why these words are a comment on those verses. I think what he's saying is, why in an era and a region where foreign men are dangerous to his daughters, why is his initial question, why did you leave him there? Why is he interested in this guy? Why would Yitro suppose that his daughters would assume that he would want them to bring him in? Because that's clearly not the norm in terms of local wanderers. But if we follow Rashi throughout, we do see Yitro as an emerging acolyte of monotheism, and he also recognizes through this water trick that so is Moshe, that even though they described him as an Ish Mitzri, one of you said this already, Yitro knows what they don't know, and he's not an Egyptian man, he's an Israelite, and therefore he should be brought into their tent. So there is a lot of knowledge that the Midrash is ascribing to Yitro about the Jacob story and about Moshe's reality that the daughters are blind to, such that he says, go get this guy. This is a guy who belongs in our tent. We want to be associated with him. Presciently, we're going to be extremely associated with him very soon, both in terms of family and in terms of faith. That's my guess. I'm just seeing what you wrote here in the chat. Roll the stone, his love to... Yeah, I don't think there's a reference to that, but it's a good reminder of the other Jacobian connections with the water, because he had power over that heavy stone when he met Rachel, which I attribute to his in love and infatuation for her. Thoughts, comments, reactions on what I just offered as an attempt to explain why Rashi is saying what he's saying. Okay, we're at 9:29. We're halfway through a Rashi, so we spent really all of today on one verse, which is great. Rather than do the next Rashi, which is also dense, even though it's short, in 40 seconds, why don't we end it here, and we'll pick up on Vayochel Lachem next Wednesday. Final
the
comments?
idea that just parents have a sense of things for their children.
Yeah.
Maybe Yitro just had a sense as a parent.
Judy, I see.
Fascinating today. Just fascinating, and how the stories of the Israelites were known in the region. Very thought-provoking.
Right. Or that Chazal wanted to fantasize that the stories of the Israelites were known in the region. There's definitely a through line in Chazal of imagining our narrative as being more significant in the outside world than it may have been, right? But yes, because the Pshat does not rely on Yitro knowing that, but the Midrashic through line does.
Yes.
Have a great Wednesday. Oh, Barry. Yes. You get the last word.
Not to be redundant here, but this is a turning point. So the daughters are introduced to him as a Mitzri, but Yithro is a turning point. His prophetic capabilities. It's the beginning of the Israelite history here. So he's turning the story.
Great. Hey, and then it's going to turn even more abruptly in the next verse, which we'll get to at some point in the distant future, given our pace.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.